Hey, and welcome to this week's coaching video for those of you who are facilitating one of Dayspring's off-campus small groups for adults. If you are doing that on the week of April the 26th, 2015, this video is designed to help you get ready to facilitate that small group. All right, so go ahead and grab your Going Deeper guide. That's the guide that you and your small group are going to be using for your discussion. I'm going to be looking at it with you here during this video and talking about some of the parts of it just to make sure that you're good and comfortable with the content. All right, so as we get ready to look at it, let me say this. Let me give you a big picture, kind of a talk about what you're going to be discussing this week. You're going to be talking about holiness because the sermon, of course, your small group discussion is going to take you further along with where we go in the sermon. But the sermon's about holiness and about how God has always expected to have a people who are holy. And the word holy, as you've learned throughout this series, it means to be set apart, to be different and unique, to be altogether other is a good description of it. But here's what we're learning about holiness, that holiness, and I really want you to maybe rethink holiness in your mind. Holiness is really more to do with what we turn to than what we turn from. We tend to think of holiness as turning away from sin, which is certainly a part of it. But what we turn to is really the primary part of holiness, and this discussion is really going to spell that out a little bit. It's what I call the principle of replacement. When you turn from something, you're always going to be turning to something else. So you're always replacing something with something else, whether you mean to or not. Sometimes we turn from something and we turn to, idleness, or we turn to, kind of doing nothing. So sometimes it does seem like we're replacing something with nothing, but ultimately you're always turning from something and to something else. And the reason I say holiness is as much to do with what we turn toward as it is what we turn from, because you can turn from something and turn to something else that's no better than what you turned from. You can get out of one bad relationship and get into another bad relationship. It didn't do you any good that you got out of this one if you get into another one that's equally as bad, right? So holiness is about not just turning from something, but it's about turning to the right thing, the principle of replacement, that you have to replace that which is sinful and that which is unholy. You have to replace it with the right thing, that which is holy. And the lesson that you're going to look at today really delves into that. So let's look at the handout together, all right? Discussion point number 1, that's your starter discussion point that takes you back to the sermon, and you'll recap what you heard or what you learned on Sunday morning. And I encourage you, as always, as the group facilitator, take good notes on Sunday so that you can make sure that discussion point number 1 doesn't fall flat on its face because no one took any notes or could remember any of the things. All right? Discussion point number 2, it says God has always wanted a holy people. That's going to be a repeat from the sermon. It says, based on what you've been hearing in this series, how would you describe holy? And this is a part where, look, by the end of this video, you probably are going to have a pretty good answer to that question. So since you already sort of know a really good answer, don't blow it on this one, all right? The discussion point number 2 is designed to help people start talking out loud. So don't go ahead and answer this one, especially off the bat. Just let everybody else talk it out loud, all right? You just kind of lay low and ask the question. Discussion point number 3. Now this is where it starts to explain some of the things that you and I just talked about. Look at it. It says, think about this. Anytime you turn away from something, you turn to something else. Whether intentional or not, you must turn towards something different. As it relates to being holy, holiness is as much about what we turn to as it is what we turn from. So discussion point number 3 really isn't up for discussion. It's just something that you read. It may help to read it twice, but this is just kind of setting the table for where you're going from here. Now, where do you go from there? Discussion point number 4, you're going to read Psalm 25, and this is a song written by King David of Israel, the great King David. And what you're going to see here, here's why you're going to look at Psalm 25 in the context of holiness and all of this, because Psalm 25 doesn't really talk about holiness explicitly, but what we see in Psalm 25 is a lot of turning from David. He's having to turn to some places, and what we're going to see is that he turns to the right things. He turns in the right direction, all right? So that's why Psalm 25 is going to be your text and your passage for your small group discussion, because you're trying to show everyone that it's not so much turning away, but the turning to that matters. So let's see what David turns to. So you'll read Psalm 25 in its entirety, and you may let someone else read that, or you can read it either way. After you read that, look at discussion point number 5. It says, it seems that David was confronted with 3 pretty common human issues when he wrote this song. He dealt with fear, guilt, and loneliness, all right? And it's not that all of those are sinful things or whatever necessarily, but we're going to see that he had to turn somewhere. Unless he wants to stay in his fear or stay in his guilt or stay in his loneliness, he's going to have to turn to something, right? So what you're going to do is now you're going to read the highlighted passages. You see them there on the bullet points. You're going to read those highlighted passages and then answer the question, what did David turn to? So you see, like on bullet point number 1, when David's facing fear, what does he turn to in that moment? You'll read verses 15 and 20 to answer that question. After your group has answered that question, you'll do the same with guilt. Then you'll do the same with loneliness. Now, here's what you should discover, is that whether it was fear, guilt, or loneliness, in all 3 instances, what we see is the specific thing that David turned to. He turned to the same thing in every single one of these. With fear, guilt, or loneliness, David turned to God, all right? Every single time. When he was afraid, he turned to God. When he was guilty, he turned to God. When he was alone, he turned to God. And what I'm submitting to you is that is the key to holiness. We have to turn specifically to God. Turning to God is the essence of becoming holy or being made holy people. It's not just enough to turn away from my loneliness. If I turn to another bad relationship or an inappropriate relationship, that's not the right thing. When I'm fearful, I can turn to and rely on some things other than God, and that's not the solution. So whether it's fear, loneliness, guilt, or anything else, a sinful thing including, we have to turn from it, but turn to God. And we see David doing that in all 3 instances. If we don't turn to God, we haven't solved anything, and we're certainly not going to become holy. And what we should all be convinced of after Sunday is that God wants us to be holy. God demands that we be holy. So what's the key to being holy? Turning to God. That's the key. Now, discussion point number 6, and by the way, let me say this before we get to discussion point number 6. When I talk about how you can turn from one thing and turn somewhere else, but you're still going to be missing the mark, I'll tell you a good point of reference for you. It can be found in Matthew chapter 12. In Matthew 12, Jesus talks about the sign of Jonah. So I don't remember where it is in Matthew 12, but you can find it that way. Jesus talks about the sign of Jonah, but in the midst of that, he begins to talk, and he uses sort of some illustrative language about demons coming into a body and leaving that body. But he uses the analogy of a house and a strong man in a house. And Jesus' point is this, that if someone gets rid of a demon, to use his terminology there, if they get rid of that demon but don't replace where that demon occupied, if they don't replace that with God, is basically what he was saying, he says that demon will come back and reoccupy the space and bring a bunch of buddies with him. And the principle that Jesus was teaching was clear. It's that principle of replacement. You have to take what is wrong or what is illegitimate or what is evil or sinful or whatever in your life. You have to turn away from that and fill that void, fill that spot and that location with godly stuff, with God himself. So that's the whole point here. And that Matthew 12 passage might come in handy for you as your group begins to discuss this whole thing about we have to turn to God, not just turn from sin. Turning from sin is not what makes us holy, because we may land in another sinful thing. It's turning to God that makes us holy. And that Matthew 12 passage might help make some sense of that as y'all discuss it, okay? Discussion point number 6, here it goes. This is kind of a bonus point, by the way. Look at what it says. It says, here's our takeaway. Achieving holiness is primarily about turning toward God. When we turn to God, we will turn away from that which is sinful. Now here's the bonus. And as we become holy, we live out God's will. For David never said, God, just tell me my next step. He simply asked, God, tell me what you are like. Tell me what your ways are like. So talk about this. Here's how you finish. Do you think the one who turns to God and achieves holiness needs to worry about missing God's will for his or her life. That's kind of a change of subject. It's a bonus point, because really what we're learning here is this, that generally speaking, if what I'm doing in my life, generally speaking, is trying to be holy, chasing after God and turning to God and learning his ways, if that's my pursuit, if my pursuit is holiness, then all the other details seem to fall into place. It's hard for me to reckon that I could be holy and then miss God's will for my life. But you know what we tend to do? God, show me my next step. Tell me which house to buy. Show me the job to take. I mean, we're all about the specifics, and those matter. But if we'll pursue holiness in general, I think these other things take care of itself. So that's kind of a bonus point that you may make it to as you talk through all this. Of course, you can finish with the memory verse if you want to, but there's a summary statement on discussion point number 7. God wants you to be holy, and when you are, the rest falls in place. All right, so that's your group handout this week. It's about holiness. God has always wanted a holy people, and God expects us to be holy as he is holy. And when we are holy, it means that we have turned to him, whether it's loneliness, fear, guilt, a sinful action, whatever it may be. If we turn to him, then we will become holy people functionally. God has made us holy, but now we have to live holy, and that's all about turning to him. And when we do that, bonus is we discover his will for our life. All right, so that's your discussion guide. I hope it's going to be helpful to you in your group. Watch the video again if you need to. Look at that Matthew passage. Do whatever you got to do to get ready for your group time. But thanks for leading it. I hope you guys have a good study. See you Sunday.